How is everyone doing? Please come on into this room. We're going to be having a 45-minute discussion about the future of trust and safety. I'd love to welcome to the stage our panelists. I'll be sitting down here with all of them, so please welcome Paul Ash. We've got, and give them all a round of applause too. We've got to bring back the energy for the afternoon. We've got Paul, and then we've got Tracy Chow and Ash Kazaryan. Tracy, come on down. One of you will sit next to me, and then the other two over here. All right, so again, the setup right now is we're talking about the future of trust and safety. I'm sure we have a very learned audience, as we heard last night from the Onion co-hosted dinner. The setup for today, as we well know, is trust and safety can be a contentious issue. It seems like whether you act sometimes is to exert power, and then questions about power dynamics, moral authority, but to not act sometimes is a case for negligence. We're talking about issues like mis and disinformation, hate speech, reducing harms online, and that's why we have this excellent panel for this discussion. I think one of the things that we think about with trust and safety to frame today's conversation that we want highly interactive, and that's why when we hear from our kind of esteemed panelists for a little bit, we're also going to open it up, and we have a runner walking around with a microphone. So I want you to start putting on your thinking muscles and thinking, what question would you like to ask and even pose for us as a very interactive roundtable? You might be thinking, well, this is a very large roundtable, but think about it, you're all sitting at a round table, so it depends on, I guess, our definition. So from that, we're going to bring it back to our panelists, close that out, and leave it with one or two final questions. We are here for 45 minutes together. One of the things to firmly kind of set up today's discussion with Tracy, Ash, and Paul is what are the values, tensions, trade-offs, and best practices when we talk about this field of trust and safety. You've all been heavily involved in this field, but as you well know, in this contentious time, political environment where people are heated, oftentimes on both sides, but I think that's one of the reasons why we're trying to come together here at Project Liberty's Summit for this kind of bipartisan blueprint for the future. But one of the things that we love to discuss is how do we get over this kind of impasse? I think we can all agree one thing that bridges that gap is that we all want this safe and trustworthy web. So Tracy, I'll start with you. When we think about the future of trust and safety, what I want to hear from all of you, 4 minutes each, right, before we open it up to this interactive questions that you have. So again, start thinking about them. A few different topics I want you to think about, right? Where are we right now with trust and safety? What are some of these tensions? And what do you think is going to kind of happen, right? So you can take that any direction you want, Tracy.
It's a big question.
We ask big questions here, and that's why we have everyone here together.
I think where we are with trust and safety right now, with regards to the platforms, is they're generally being, like the teams are getting slashed. It's not prioritized, so you see one tension there, which is the market incentives of the companies to make more money and viewing trust and safety as a cost center. Okay. And there's no other real reasons to force them to keep doing the trust and safety work.
Can I ask a quick follow-up with that? I imagine a few people are probably thinking, and I know a lot of people who were at previous Twitter, you know, when there was that major slashing of trust and safety positions. Is that specifically what you're thinking about? And what
there's that, but also Meta did big layoffs. Yeah. A lot of teams have just been taking advantage of this moment. I mean, there are clear economic drivers of the layoffs, but sometimes it's also like, oh, it's not that important anymore. We can lay off these people. And I think sometimes people think that it's just either the platforms do something or government has to step in. Yeah. My big push is that there should be more solutions available to users. third-party developers should be able to build solutions. Like my company, Block Party, builds tools for better user control and user empowerment. And my contention is that we should make it possible for more developers to build these solutions where the platforms can or won't build them. But we also have this problem where it's very difficult to build these solutions because the platforms are not open. And this is where regulation could come in to say, like, you must give users more choice, more algorithmic choice in the way that Blue Sky does it, or just like more ways to access moderation services like their labelers or different feeds. But right now the big platform companies don't want to do that. So then we're kind of stuck in this like tension of like, well, the government should do more. Should they limit speech? Like, okay, that's not great. And Ash will have many more comments about this.
Yeah, and what I would add to this, and then Ash will move on to you, is some of you might be familiar with the current lawsuit with Ethan Zuckerman, right? He was trying to build that app around like unfollowing people on Facebook, and Facebook didn't allow it. Maybe some of the same tensions that you had with Twitter and Block Party. I know there was contentions, for that. So yeah, well said with that. So Ash, love to move on with you. So again, to reiterate the question, where do you see our current climate of trust and safety, and where is it headed?
The current climate of trust and safety, I think, is very similar to the climate outside of this hotel right now. It's cold and uncomfortable. And we're entering 2025 that is going to have a new Congress and a new leadership at the White House that has already expressed that they see some of the trust and safety practices and structures as censorship complex that they have described. It's, in my opinion, misguided in the sense that there are problems around government job loaning companies and forcing them to take certain things down or keep them up, and both political parties are guilty of that. But seeing the profession of trust and safety and the structures that exist as the enemy is going to create a very, I'm looking for a good adjective for this, uneducated debate around those in the next 2 years. So we're going to need a lot of very patient and educated people to participate in these debates and explain what trust and safety is, what it does, and why our current internet ecosystem wouldn't even be manageable without it.
So if I can ask a follow-up with that, I mean, it does seem like there's differences sometimes of opinion, right? One person's positive trust and safety is, to your point, you see sometimes how it's covered from a different angle, and they view it in these kind of Orwellian terms. They always talk about, something that you might be familiar with, like Nina Jankowicz and what she got caught up with when she was doing the DHS kind of information integrity type of committee that seemed to get in the crosshairs of like the political debate. So how do you think we can help maybe lessen some of this if there's misunderstanding or tensions?
Two things. First one is sunlight. So let's change the weather outside. Let's get transparency into these processes and these conversations. So when government is talking to platforms about a certain issue or is talking to them about taking something down or keeping it up, let the public, let the civil society, let the journalists have access to those communications. There are certain bills in Congress right now that are focused on that transparency, and instead of saying, oh no, government, you can never speak to tech companies ever again, even if you're like trying to flag, I don't know, a terrorist threat or something like that. Instead, let us understand, when are you talking to them, what are you asking them? There was a lawsuit last year that it's going to probably come back up for the courts at the Supreme Court, Murphy v. Missouri. It's a very messy lawsuit with a lot of moving pieces to it. But in the discovery that was hundreds of pages, you could see that there were some emails from government officials that, in my opinion, were not okay for a government official to be using their position and emailing tech companies, demanding certain things. And we would have never even seen that if it wasn't for that lawsuit and the discovery that happened in that lawsuit. So I think the first step is actually figuring out when these conversations happen. Let's open that up. Let's have some sunlight. And I think the second one is focusing on, instead of telling the companies what to do or like what trust and safety should be. I mean, right now we have this with X. I had to force myself to say X. Right now we have it with X where the user experience has changed and a lot of people have left the platform for Blue Sky or for Threads. Let companies have their own trust and safety practices and then users decide. Empower users, make it easier, create interoperability to let them leave the platforms.
Yeah, very well said. And then obviously we just heard from Jay, the CEO of Blue Sky, which I know a lot of people in the community are flocking to. You also underlined a very important part of what's the relationship between a tech company and the governmental bodies. I think that's opens it up sometimes for some form where people view it as inappropriate if it's too cozy of a relationship. But on the flip side of the argument, as you well know, tech companies oftentimes see the benefit of people with that governmental experience about how a lot of this can successfully get done. But Paul, love to move on your way. Obviously with Christchurch Call Foundation, big uptick in the global need for trust and safety after the Christchurch massacre, and then obviously with the Prime Minister Ardern of New Zealand getting very active in this space. I think one thing in particular that a lot of people saw is how platforms like YouTube really created a situation where it's almost like a whack-a-mole around the horrendous video. But Paul, I'd love to kind of pose that question for you, the current state of trust and safety and where it's going.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to join. I'm actually, I think, in screaming agreement with Ash on a lot of this. The Christchurch massacre was like nothing we'd seen online before. The live stream was incredibly well planned by the attacker. There was a very deliberate effort to game the systems that worked inside tech firms designed to deal with that problem, and to then game the algorithmic processes that would spread that content. And it spread incredibly, like we'd never seen before. I think you're right, there was a really significant uptick in tightening up provisions around live streaming, for instance. We know from the firms that their trust and safety teams worked really hard and had a whole range of new policies put in place to deal with that kind of content. We have seen budget cuts really erode some of that on some platforms. I think even our closest contacts in the companies would agree with that. Where we try to focus with the Christchurch call, though, is on outcomes rather than a prescriptive process to get there. And I think that's actually really important. You can, as Ash describes, create a competitive market for users. You can give users more agency, as Block Party is looking to do. There's also, I think, real importance in some of the work we've been doing around transparency guidelines for governments. That's part of the quid pro quo of an expectation that companies will ensure that illegal content is not kept up. Where that gets much trickier, I think, is rowing back upstream from content moderation as the sole tool and looking for a range of other tools that can be used to try and keep people safe online. So we've tried to take a very holistic view of trust and safety. It's not just about having hordes of people that aren't paid well to experience a lot of traumatic content in order that those of us in developed economies don't have to see it. That's not where we want to go at all. But we do want to be in a space where there's a layered approach and a whole range of different measures that are transparent and evident, and hopefully that will take some of the sting out of this. I guess the last thing we identified, and it does go to the state of trust and safety, is that this wasn't a problem that we could expect tech firms to solve on their own. That actually the conditions that predisposed people to abuse of the internet in the way that the Christchurch terrorists did emerge as much from societal conditions as they do the online environment, and that we had to find a way to ensure that governments, industry, civil society and academia were in an ongoing dynamic conversation about how to deal with that. Because the absence of that conversation means you end up with the sort of binary false choices that we see at the moment, and the inability then to actually step beyond that and try and find solutions.
Well, that's one of the things I think a lot of us in the space are always kind of struck with is we have to make a lot of assumptions about human behavior when we're dealing with this, right? We're not bots. We're still humans, and humans can be irrational beings. I know one of the first times, Tracy, that I saw your work pre-COVID. Anybody remember the pre-COVID time, right? Seems like life in amber, but there was a time, and I saw Tracy speaking in New York about your previous experience being one of the early employees at Pinterest for their trust and safety team. And I know one of the things that struck me is you were talking about the team having to decide, are humans inherently good or bad? And that's a really important fundamental question of how you even frame trust and safety. So any kind of updates on your thinking on that? Are humans inherently good or bad? What do you think? Is you've gone through quite the experiences. You're a public figure, so that comes with pros and drawbacks of people who reach out. Like, has that changed how you even think about the field of trust and safety?
I don't think it's fundamentally changed, but some of the refinements on my thinking are that even if we do, I am optimistic about human nature, I think. But even if most people are fundamentally good, you always end up with a few weirdos, wackos, I don't know. And at scale, at consumer web scale, even if it's a very tiny percentage of people who are going to do bad things, like the raw numbers of those are still like not something you can ignore. Yeah. So if you have an audience of 100,000 or 1 million, you're going to end up with a few kind of crazy people who do bad things, like at a minimum. Mm-hmm. And there are also emergent behaviors that come from the internet and this ability for people to like dogpile on or organize that wasn't possible before. So even if the original threads of the sexism or racism or hate or misogyny are inherent to humans, they can get magnified by technology and then enabled as well to happen at a much larger scale. Definitely.
Well said. Now is the time where we're going to get into the Q&A, but to exercise our muscles to wake you up from the lunch that we all just had, I'd like to open it up just with a kind of a group question. When we think about whether, like the next couple years, like the next 4 years, let's say, do we think, and raise your hand if you agree, do you think that trust and safety teams are going to be expanded or reduced at major tech companies? So how about raise your hand if you think trust and safety teams will be reduced? Okay, you can put your hands down. Now raise your hands for the optimists in the room if you think that trust and safety teams will be expanded. All right.
I'm actually going to challenge you.
Do tell, Ash.
My challenge to your question is that I think in the next 5 years, the big tech companies that we currently consider the big tech, unless they get regulated and become the, like the incumbents become the main ones. But I think if you look at current social media business, they're already challengers coming in to take their places. Yeah. I am a millennial. My siblings are all Gen Z. And they don't use the same social media I use, or maybe they hide from me on Instagram, I don't know. But I think in those companies that are currently growing, like Discord, like companies like Blue Sky, I think their trust and safety teams are going to expand. Trust and safety teams at AI companies are going to expand. So I think there is growth in that field, just not at like Meta or Google. I
like that. Well said. Oh, Paul, yeah.
I'm almost at the point of asking whether that's the right question. Partly because I completely agree with you, Ash. We work with a lot of those small firms and are watching their capabilities grow. But partly because every firm having to grow that capability on their own is actually really problematic, because they won't achieve critical mass on their own. But the second piece is, I think we've been dragged partly by regulation and by reporting requirements around the number of trust and safety staff into a discussion about numbers of people as a proxy for a discussion that should be about the outcomes of that work. And it may well be that technology actually sees a significant reduction in the number of trust and safety staff, but a real lift in the quality of the outcomes. While at the same time reducing the harms that large numbers of people in moderation factories in the developing world are exposed to, because we're able to use machine learning and other tools for that. So I'm a bit leery about the discussion around numbers. I've seen them used a lot, and I'm not sure that they're an exact proxy for
Right, you want to
good
focus on the outcomes.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I intentionally did that, and now we're going to move to audience Q&A, right? Because it's Cunningham's law. If you ask the wrong question on the internet, people tend to respond because they want to make it right. So now we are going to open up some audience questions. So do raise your hand if you have a question, and then we should have a microphone. You see the microphone in the back going around. And please, since we have limited time together for our 45 total minutes, just state your name and association, and then quickly to your question for our panel.
Thank you. I'm Brigham Adams from Goodly Labs. We build Public Editor, which is an online bullshit detector. Moving from your observation, Tracy, it seems to me like, oh no, now I'm blanking completely on everything I was thinking. The question is, oh man, can y'all come back to me? I have not got enough.
This has happened to me many times, don't worry.
Yes, we can come back. We'll come back. Raise your hand if you have another question.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, please. We've got a question directly from the panel.
I would love to
Tracy.
ask Ash her opinions on COSA, the Kid Online Safety Act.
You did this on purpose.
In 30 seconds or less.
I believe that in the current draft form, or I guess form that passed Senate, COSA would be used by the government, whoever you end up in, like the power in, to go after their own political agenda, and that is why it hasn't passed the House, actually. House Republican leadership thinks that COSA can be used by Democratic politicians to go after pro-life movement. Same applies, I believe that COSA can be used by more conservative politicians to go after LGBTQA plus youth and their experience online. So I think that when we talk about these regulations and the harms that might be possible, I know COSA is very popular in this room, it's okay. But we need to also understand the unintended consequences. I can't believe that Senator Blumenthal and Senator Blackburn had the best intentions of protecting the youth in mind, but what they think protecting the youth means is actually very different between them.
All right. Very well said, and we allow for all the divergent views on this and to think about the consequences sometimes, as we know, with good intention. So we're going to get to another audience question.
Great. I'm Jonathan Wolf, CTO of MeWe. We're the first social network on the Frequency platform, and we are growing our trust and safety team, not shrinking it. I want to talk about blocking. I want to question how we can use blocking most effectively. If you look at Twitter, X, they've disempowered their block function, right? Controversially, so that it doesn't really block. Blue Sky has made a great bit of progress encouraging blocking and growing their trust and safety to support that. But how can we avoid bad actors from weaponizing blocking by reporting people who they disagree with but aren't bad themselves, worthy of blocking? How do you disambiguate that signal and really surface the blocking that is valuable versus the blocking that is weaponized?
Yeah, great question. Then obviously there was the debate around politicians, whether they have the ability to block or whether that should be prevented. Anybody would like to take that question? Paul, Ash, Tracy?
I can start. I think a lot comes down to what you mean by blocking. And I think it's useful to differentiate blocking in a very individual one-to-one context versus reporting. And if you're trying to report people, to take them down and deplatform them, then that reporting functionality can well be weaponized, and it was frequently weaponized on Twitter. I think some of the concerns around blocking being weaponized are much more subtle. It's not like we're just trying to take somebody's account down. There are these sorts of blocking dragnet effects, or people who will create block lists that seem to be pro-LGBTQ and then start sneaking in anti-trans agendas in there. And so it's more subtle in that way than it's tracking who is actually maintaining these block lists that are getting propagated and being aware to that. But that's a little different than having these features fully be weaponized against individuals. So I think it's really up to the people to use these tools in a way that makes sense for them. Even on Twitter, like the blocking functionality changed a little bit, but really the salient change was that people that you would block can still see your tweets. And I think the argument from the current leadership at X or the people working on it was that, well, they could have done that anyways, that they just like log into another account. Some of the other functionality is still there. Like if you block somebody, they can't tag you, they can't get into your DM. So it still does have some protections, but maybe it's not as good. There's not nearly as much friction as you've wanted before. So I guess like sort of questioning the question of it, it's like, well, what do we mean by blocking, and like what exact harms are we trying to solve for?
Yeah. Or Ash or Paul, I think you were going to say something.
Thank you. I think some of this comes back to the principle of user agency and making sure that where possible, folk online are able to have the agency to make decisions around who engages with them and who doesn't. That comes back a bit to the earlier question around whether people are good or bad. There's a strong whiff of John Perry Barlow about this meeting, which is great. God bless him. And if we go back to the Declaration on the Independence of Cyberspace and the utopian vision there, unfortunately, it turns out Hobbes was right, I think, that people online can be expected to behave in the same sorts of ways they would behave offline. What we haven't yet achieved online is the same sets of social mores or tools for moderating and engaging in that in a way that gives people the agency that we have. When Ash and Tracy and I met each other earlier today, we had a set of social conventions that mean we find out who we are, we talk, we engage, and it's a safe space. We have not yet developed that online, and it's not surprising. It's been so fast, and it's taken us thousands of years to get to where we've got to offline. Tools like blocking and similar sorts of things that give users agency, I think, are really important as we try and work that one through, and we'll find that maybe they're weaponized in ways we didn't expect, or that agency is misused and we have to actually go back and adjust. But it's that process of calibration that enables us to retain as much of that spirit of the mid-90s as possible, or reclaim it given what's been done by large firms over the last 10 to 15 years, that I think is really important.
And I think it's interesting to note, and then Ash, we'll get to your point, that you mentioned the Cyberspace Manifesto, right? So that happened in 1997 in reaction from the Communications Decency Act, which most of it outside of Section 230 got sliced down. So there was that kind of mania around going after pornography, and then seeing that kind of philosophical difference, which I think Jaron Lanier really kind of pointed out, that you have this cyber libertarian ethos, and then you have a whole other side of it that is getting into, okay, the internet is growing up now, and what is that going to look like, and more comfortable of having a relationship between tech companies and governmental bodies, as opposed to seeing the web as totally separate entity, its own universe. Ash.
Funny that you say the mania around banning pornography, because it's back. We're currently, there's a couple of cases that one of them just made it to a Supreme Court, Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, because Texas decided to, in short, ban pornography. I won't bore you with details, so we'll see what happens there, although I have a pretty good feeling that it's going to get struck down as unconstitutional. To answer the question, you mentioned there was like a conversation around politicians and their right of blocking. The Supreme Court did rule on that. Basically, if a politician is using an account in their like political capacity, or even if it's a personal account but they keep using it in political capacity, the court said they can't block users, because like the users have a right to like engage with them over in their official capacity. So that's like a small part of the puzzle that has been solved, quote unquote. But I'll let us get back to the questions.
Good, and then Brigham,
I've got it this time.
Good.
So
take it away.
Tracy, you were saying that like trust and safety is often seen as a cost center, and a lot of the discussion is about helping people prevent sometimes serious online harms, CSAM, hate speech, stuff like this. But I'm wondering, on the other side of this, maybe to Paul's point, is there a way to create metrics or incentives of kind of quality information or quality engagement and build a business model around that? Could there be like a business model for truth, or for truthier content, or like more civil content? Is that a possibility anyone sees in the offing?
So are you getting into, to quickly follow up, like more of like pro-social type of design?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So instead of just trust and safety is like, how do we prevent harms? Can we actually move towards some virtuous cycle of producing better and better behavior?
Okay. Tracy, Paul, or Ash, any thoughts on that?
I can start.
Right, so to kind of reframe that, right, it's like we're so focused on the whack-a-mole, reducing bad. How do we flip it around? This is where oftentimes people talk about human flourishing, designing a web that brings out the best in us as opposed to solely taking out our worst impulses.
Like hiding the veggies so we eat them as a digital society. I wish I knew. I'm a free speech lawyer. I don't design things. I wish I knew the way to design them in a way that society can consume. Throughout, let's say, the 20th century and now, we have noticed just that society engages with more negative outputs better. Way before the internet existed, newspapers and TV and radio would want to grab your attention and grab the headline, and 9 times out of 10 it wasn't like a positive thing about like a puppy saving a kitten or something. It was something criticizing. It was a conspiracy theory. It was something being taken out of context or embellished. So again, this is not a question for a lawyer, but in my experience throughout the history, that just has been not the case. If we as a society can turn this around, it would be lovely. In my personal experience, I randomly went viral for something I saw on DC Metro, and people were wishing me death. And I was like, I was just trying to make sure this guy doesn't die. So I think people are inherently bad. To answer your question.
Yeah. Well, but that also gets into, if you look at some of the commentary from Tim Berners-Lee lately about, do we need to move into more micro communities? Is the inherent problem that we're trying to connect the world at large, and maybe that in itself is a folly in the sense that you don't want everybody in your proverbial kitchen. So therein lies the rub. So we have time for.
Wait, Trey, I want to.
Oh yeah, please. Tracy. Oh yeah, Tracy, please.
I have one idea. I don't know if it exactly solves the problem of like incentivizing trust and safety, but if we go back to this idea of being able to choose your own experience. So if we live in a world where people can choose more of their experience online, you could choose the algorithm. I know it's very technical, but if you imagine something like you want your kid to only see kid-friendly things on whatever social network they're using. If Disney could create their Disney branded, affirmed, curated feed, then as a parent you might want to subscribe to that and say I trust Disney to make sure that my kid sees good stuff. But there needs to be a little bit more of this marketplace of options. There are some people who will pay a little more. I'm thinking about the examples of people who shop at Whole Foods, even though it's more expensive, but you think it's better for you, you like the quality better, you'll spend more because you care. It's not the biggest necessarily, and there's going to be people who don't want to pay. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we run into with social media platforms now is most people just are used to free, and it's nice when it's free. You don't have to pay to use it. And if you don't have enough people using it, then it's not interesting. So free kind of seems like the best way to go. But I think there is possibility for these experiences to be curated, people to start to realize if they want a better experience, they can pay for it. But obviously there's other foundational work we need to do to even get to the point that people have that choice.
Yeah, and Paul.
I think there's a few key things that underlie this, and I completely agree with what we've just heard. One of those is, I guess, the sense of people valuing their own agency and the data that they bring with them. So free isn't free. Free is you give up an enormous amount of yourself to be curated by someone else and monetized, and that I don't think is all that well understood by users at the moment, and is one of the major challenges that we face. The second is actually understanding the curation and algorithmic modification processes that we're subjected to at the moment, and having more transparency around those as an underpinning basis for that. It's one of the reasons in the work we do with the Christchurch Call that we've gone back upstream from content moderation to ask how users end up being drawn towards more engaging but dangerous content, and how they then get flipped to radicalisation to violence online. We're working with an entity called OpenMind, who are looking at open data infrastructures and privacy enhancing technologies to make it possible to bring about some of that transparency, and for researchers to look at queries that will then give an empirical basis for designing some of the more pro-social models. The last piece there, I think, and it's exactly where Tracy was going, is giving users choice about the type of experience they want. And we've seen many of the tech firms edge towards that, or give a little limited amount. They then bump up sometimes against their monetization models and engagement models, and I think there's probably a quite significant transition to make there too. Something more like subscription-based services, or the ability to either freely or pay for, make the choice for exactly the type of experience you want, whether you want, an Aristotelian ethics algorithm run over the top of your experience, or you'd like a ultimate cage fighting experience. They're different ends of the spectrum, but those options.
Well, I think that's what we're realizing, and then we'll get to our final question. Please raise your hand if there's one quick question. But to your point, Paul, right? We all have different interpretations of what safety even means. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jamie Nykery from Issue One, which is a democracy reform nonprofit based here in DC. First, I would just say that I think probably the reason COSA has stalled in the House is that Mike Johnson and Steve Scalise spun up some poorly defined concerns with the bill, and now Meta is putting a $5 billion data center in Louisiana. I will let you all connect the dots there. My question is about Brendan Carr's comments about broad-scale censorship and his desire to use the FTC or FCC to combat some of those concerns that he sees. I'm curious just how you think this FCC could impact trust and safety professionals.
Yeah, so let's get into that. Whether or not there could be a tampering of your free speech lawyer. Like, is this going to affect people in the space, researchers, civil society orgs? Who would like to lean into this? Ash.
Well, I think the quick answer is in the end it won't, but for like a year it will, because FCC is going to try and establish authority over trust and safety field and in general content moderation and speech regulation. At least that's what they have said right now. We don't know what they're going to do, but that's what has been said by Commissioner, future Chairman Carr. But because Chevron has been repealed, now it's clear FCC actually doesn't have authority to do it. So after some court battles and legal bills, I think we'll be okay.
Okay. Well said. So now I want to just go back to all of us right here and get into the question of when we think about what's the next step, right? Because Ash, you talked about the weather. The weather outside is frightful, right? So even though we're headed into winter, how can the future be so bright that I've got to wear shades, right? Like how do I get more optimistic here? So I want to ask all of you, Ash, if you feel like starting, and then we'll go to Paul and then Tracy. Just quickly, where do we go from here? What's the next step, right? We know that this is messy, so how do we clean this up and bridge this gap so we can hopefully have a bright future of trust and safety?
I really was hoping you were going to say the winter is coming. So I think the solution to the current tornado of issues that is occurring is creating systems and is focusing on creating systems and best practices that are not controlled by one or the other political party. Might that be? I'm obviously right now being very US-centric, but I think it applies across the globe, where if you don't create tools and give government tools to be able to regulate speech, I think then we as a civil society can hold the industry up to certain standards and hold them accountable and demand more safety and better experience online. And at the same time, we won't give government tools to decide for us what our speech experience should be like.
Yeah, very well said. Paul?
I'll go global rather than US if I could. If you look across the globe, the state of democracies and of liberal democracies is really troubling. The VDIM index is probably the best way to try and understand that, and maybe a quarter of the world's countries can still be considered liberal democracies, maybe half of those to be in a reasonable state where they're not sliding towards autocracy. That's about 20 countries where we can work to try and actually build some human rights respecting and free, open and secure internet respecting models for solving this problem. I guess set against that, we're also seeing a slide into multilateral efforts to try and govern the internet, largely pushed by Russia and China over the years. That also looks quite troubling because it puts a statist view right in the middle of internet governance in a way that is really difficult. So if I were to say the most important thing I think we could do at the moment is look at ways that, beyond Ash's point of one side of the partisan divide or the other, lift this up out of just being solely about states or solely about companies and ensure that multi-stakeholder processes are built that enable good transparency, good oversight, and a focus on outcomes that respect human rights and a free, open, and secure internet, but keep people safe.
Yeah, definitely. And sunlight is the best disinfectant, as we know. Tracy.
I also have somewhat of a bleak outlook right now. I'm a little bit concerned about the platforms right now, which are quite large, being under single points of control, which can then get co-opted. So right now, it's mostly just the tech companies who are in control. But as you can see, ownership can flip, and then it could actually be taken over by an authoritarian regime. We're already seeing some of this happen with X, where Elon took over the platform, completely changed the algorithm, and now he's basically in the government and can use this as like essentially state-run media. So I'm very concerned that this is the current state of the platforms. A few very more practical ways we could start to try to address this is one, like just transparency and understanding what's happening. So like we need researcher APIs to be able to study what's happening to even be able to document, understand what are the potential interventions. But we also need to just like break up that control so that it's not within that, like there's that single chokehold. So I will keep pushing on this. That we need to have more algorithmic control. I don't know how we're going to get there, especially in a deregulatory regime. Maybe Europe can push enough under like DSA and DMA, but we need to get to a point where like it's not these like single points of control. I don't know that it's going to be like just break up the tech companies because of the network effects of these companies. Interop kind of works, but I think unlinking platforms from like the one algorithm that is on the platform is probably an easier step. And I'm just deeply concerned about like the information ecosystem being so broken because of the way the platforms work right now, which directly imperils democracy if you don't have an informed public, because the information ecosystem is so polluted. Like, how can we reasonably vote for things that are actually going to be good for us?
Yeah. Very well said. So we just have 5 minutes left, but we want to open it up for one final quick question for us together. And then, of course, stay in and see us in the hallway for your questions with Tracy, Ash, and Paul. So please raise your hand if you have our final question to close us out. Yes, please.
I was waiting from before.
Oh, perfect.
Zach Farrar. I'm building a social media platform, live streaming, competing with TikTok Live, essentially. And from the ground up, we're building trust and safety as like a core part of the platform. We're trying to make it a differentiator. And to speak on like incentivizing people to behave better, we're trying to gamify positive behavior and also negative behavior, that you get nudged down like with like soft trust and safety actions. So a decrease to your algorithm score, basically, if you are an asshole to someone, not something that would be a hard action. And then you get rewarded if you were welcoming to someone or you had a good interaction with them. It's still theoretical. We have built out the basics of the hard actions, but the soft actions are in the process. I wanted to ask, is there soft actions to the negative or the positive that you guys have seen that have been effective? And what could that look like?
All right, let's close this out. So soft actions that we can take to hopefully have a better experience. Who wants to jump in to close us out for our remaining 3 minutes together? We all look like we're deeply thinking, but Paul, we'll start with you there.
I was thinking too, I just want to talk about the hard edges, because there are some things that aren't amenable to soft or other actions, and that is, if you're building a live streaming platform, you will have people attempting to emulate what the Christchurch attacker did, and there's a hard edge there that you need to find a way to deal with. So please come and have a chat with us about the Christchurch call, because we've got a bunch of trust and safety people in the call who've worked on this issue and been learnt the hard way. Happy to help share that experience. In terms of the softer ones, I think pro-social nudges, many of the other firms that we've worked with have found ways to ensure that users had to have a certain user base before they could live stream, that their account had to be there for a while, that again they had to have a bunch of positive indicators. I think all of those things being built in have made a difference to a number of the companies that we work with in the Christchurch call that have had significant live streaming capabilities for a long time.
Perfect. Yeah, Ash.
I don't think this is, again, I don't know anything about building product. Good luck. I think one thing I've seen in my line of work is that community-based moderation and community-based engagement, so Reddit community, editors, or even community notes on Twitter X, seem to be like a very positively met and overall positive tools to be able to combat whatever some bad actors are doing. So that might be something, but then again, don't listen to lawyers.
Tracy, it looks Tracy, it looks like you're going to be closing us out, like the soft ways that we can, make a difference here and approach it. I know before you said you were feeling kind of pessimistic, but is there anything actionable that can hopefully improve the current situation?
I think in answer to that question, like soft nudges, I don't have a clear enough understanding of what that means and how it would actually get implemented in practice to really say, you could imagine something like a like or a kudos or one of those things as like a good nudge, but we already have those things. So are you going to do it in any different way than it already exists? Is it coming from other users? Or are you going to do it algorithmically? If you're going to do it algorithmically, what is the algorithm? How are you going to figure that out? Is it machine learning based? People will for sure learn how to game the system to do things that you don't want them to do. So how resistant are you to those sorts of gaming mechanisms? So it's just kind of like a, for me, not well defined enough question. But I like the idea of trying to encourage people to do nice things. It's just in practice, you have to put it out there and see what people do.
Well, I'm going to encourage us all to do something nice. Let's give a round of applause to everybody on stage right now. We got Tracy, Ash, and Paul. So please continue the conversation. We want this to be interactive, but our time has ended. But find us out there. We want the future of trust and safety to be bright. So thank you all. Thank you.